The air in Aurelia was not merely conditioned, it was curated. It smelled of money, a subtle blend of vintage leather, expensive perfume, and the faintest, most delicious hint of truffle oil from the kitchen. It was an atmosphere designed to make the absurdly wealthy feel perfectly at home, and to make anyone else feel like an intruder. Ilara Vance was, by definition, an intruder. For 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, she moved through this gilded cage with a practiced invisibility, her black uniform a shadow against the restaurant's cream and gold decor. Her feet ached. It was a deep, foundational ache that started in her heels and radiated up her spine. She was on the back half of a double shift, a grueling 16-hour marathon she'd picked up to help cover her sister's latest round of medical bills. The thought of Chloe, pale but smiling in her hospital bed, was the fuel that kept her going. It was the reason she could smile serenely while a woman wearing a diamond necklace worth more than her apartment complained that her Pellegrino wasn't bubbly enough. Tonight's main event was Table 7, Julian Croft. The name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in the city's financial districts. He was the CEO of Croft Innovations, a tech behemoth he had built from the ground up, with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and a personality to match. He was new money, and he wore it like a suit of armor, loud and impenetrable. Tonight he was dining with a woman at least 20 years his junior, a model with vacant eyes and a practiced laugh that tinkled like cheap glass. From the moment he sat down, Croft had been a storm of petty demands. The lighting was too dim, the music was too loud, the sommelier was an idiot. He'd sent back a perfectly cooked steak, claiming it was a disgrace to the cow it came from. Each complaint was delivered with a dismissive wave of his hand, a flick of the wrist that said, "You are nothing. Your efforts are nothing. I am everything." Ilara handled it all with the same placid expression she gave every difficult customer. She was a ghost, a pair of hands that refilled his water, cleared his plates, and absorbed his contempt without a flicker of emotion. Inside, however, a cold knot was tightening in her stomach. She had seen men like Julian Croft before. Men who believed their wealth absolved them of basic human decency. Men who saw service staff not as people, but as extensions of the furniture. The final act of the excruciating meal arrived on a silver tray. A bottle of 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild. A wine that cost more than Ilara's monthly rent. The sommelier, a man with decades of experience, had already been summarily dismissed by Croft, who insisted on opening the bottle himself with a theatrical flourish. He then shoved the bottle toward Ilara. "Pour," he commanded, not looking at her. His attention was fixed on his date, a predatory smile plastered on his face as he told a story about a corporate takeover. Ilara picked up the heavy bottle. Her hands were steady, her movements fluid from years of practice. She tilted the neck towards his glass, the deep crimson liquid beginning its short, expensive journey. And then it happened. A busboy rushing past jostled her arm. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible bump, but it was enough. A single dark red drop escaped the stream. It arced through the air in a perfect, horrifying parabola and landed directly on the pristine white cuff of Julian Croft's custom-tailored shirt. The drop was no bigger than a teardrop. It bloomed instantly on the fine Egyptian cotton, a tiny, violent stain. Croft stopped talking mid-sentence. The entire table went silent. His head swiveled slowly, his eyes cold and grey as a winter sky, locking onto the red blemish. He looked at the stain, then at Ilara's face. The silence in the restaurant, which had been a low, contented hum, seemed to deepen, every patron suddenly aware that a fuse had been lit at table 7. "You clumsy little—" he began, his voice a low growl. "Sir, I am so terribly sorry," Ilara said, her voice calm and professional, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Please, allow me to take care of the cleaning bill. It was an accident." Croft's face, which had been merely angry, contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The idea that she, a nobody, could fix this with money, her paltry, insignificant money, was an insult far greater than the stain itself. He was not angry about the shirt. He was angry at the disruption of his power, the momentary lapse in the perfect, ordered world he paid so much to maintain. "An accident," he hissed. "This shirt costs more than you make in a month. This wine costs more than you make in a year. You don't fix this. You are a mistake." He raised his hand. Ilara saw it coming in slow motion, the glint of his ridiculously large gold signet ring, the tightening of the tendons in his wrist, the sneer of contempt on his lips. The world narrowed to that single impending impact. There was no time to flinch, no time to recoil. The sound of the slap was sharp and ugly, a crack that sliced through the hushed ambience of Aurelia. It wasn't a shove or a tap. It was a full-force, open-palmed strike that snapped her head to the side, her cheek erupting in a blaze of white-hot pain. The force of it sent a shockwave through her entire body. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Every fork was frozen halfway to a mouth. Every conversation died. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on their table, a tableau of shock and horror. Croft's date had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide. Croft himself stood there, his hand still slightly raised, chest heaving, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Ilara slowly turned her head back to face him. A single tear, born of pure, reflexive pain, welled in her eye, but it did not fall. The stinging on her cheek was already being replaced by something else, a cold, ancient calm. The knot of tension in her stomach didn't just loosen. It vanished, replaced by a profound and terrifying stillness. The ghost, the invisible servant, was gone. Someone else was looking out of her eyes now. She felt the weight of the champagne bottle in her other hand, a bottle of Dom Pérignon she had been about to deliver to the adjacent table. It felt solid, real, a tool of consequence. Julian Croft saw the shift in her eyes and smirked, mistaking her silence for fear. "What's the matter?" he sneered. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you finally learning your place?" He was about to learn his. The sting on Ilara's cheek was a focal point, a burning star in the constellation of her senses. But it wasn't pain she registered. It was a trigger. The carefully constructed facade of Ilara Vance, Waitress, a persona she had worn for 3 long years, crumbled into dust. The exhaustion, the deference, the forced smiles, they all evaporated in the heat of that single violent act. What remained was something older, colder, and infinitely more patient. Julian Croft's sneer was still plastered on his face. He saw her stillness not as a threat, but as submission. He had struck her, and the world had not ended. He was Julian Croft. The world bent to his will. He was invincible. He turned to his date, ready to make a joke, to dismiss the incident and reassert his dominance. "You see, darling," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "that's how you handle incompetence." He never finished the sentence. Ilara's movement was not hurried or panicked. It was a study in fluid dynamics, a single, unbroken motion of purpose. Her left hand, the one holding the champagne bottle, rose from her side. The green glass, beaded with condensation, caught the light of the crystal chandelier above, glinting like an emerald. It was a 2008 vintage, heavy and dense, a magnum. The diners at the surrounding tables, who had been frozen in shock, let out a collective gasp. It was a sound of dawning comprehension, the realization that the initial horror of the slap was merely the prelude. The manager, a perpetually flustered man named Jean-Pierre, started moving from across the room, his mouth forming a desperate, "Mademoiselle, no." But he was a world away. Time seemed to stretch and warp around table 7. Croft, hearing the gasp, turned back towards Ilara. The smirk on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion as he saw the bottle arcing towards his head. His eyes widened, but his body, cushioned by years of decadent living and supreme arrogance, was too slow to react. The impact was not the sharp crack of the slap. It was a sickening, percussive thud, a sound both muffled and resonant, like a melon being struck with a hammer. The thick glass of the Dom Pérignon bottle connected squarely with the side of Croft's head, just above his temple. For a millisecond, the bottle held, a testament to the pressure it was designed to contain. Then it exploded. The pop of the cork was lost in the shattering of the glass. A fountain of pale gold champagne, foam, and razor-sharp shards erupted outwards. The spray drenched Croft, his date, and the pristine white tablecloth. The scent of yeast and green apples filled the air, a bizarrely festive aroma for such a brutal act. Julian Croft made a noise, a choked, gurgling sound of pure shock and agony. He staggered backward, his hands flying to his head. His eyes, moments before filled with rage and contempt, were now wide with disbelief and pain. Blood, dark and shockingly red, began to well from a gash on his temple, mixing with the champagne and running in grotesque rivulets down his face and onto the collar of his now ruined shirt. He stumbled, his legs giving way, and collapsed back into his chair, which skidded and tipped over, sending him crashing to the floor in an undignified heap of flailing limbs and expensive tailoring. Ilara stood over him, perfectly still. She held the jagged neck of the broken bottle in her hand, its sharp edges dripping with a mixture of champagne and his blood. Her face was a blank canvas, devoid of fear, of anger, of anything at all. The fire on her cheek was gone, replaced by an icy calm. The restaurant erupted into chaos. People screamed. Chairs scraped against the floor as patrons scrambled to get away. Jean-Pierre finally arrived, his face ashen, babbling into his phone to call the police and an ambulance. Security guards converged on the scene, but Ilara paid them no mind. Her attention was focused solely on the man groaning on the floor amidst the wreckage of his meal. She took a single step forward, her sensible black shoes crunching on the broken glass. She leaned down, not to help him, but to be heard over the rising din. Julian Croft looked up at her, his vision blurring. Through the haze of pain and concussion, he saw her face, and for the first time, he felt a sliver of genuine, primal fear. Her eyes were not the eyes of the meek waitress he had struck. They were ancient and knowing, and they looked at him not as a man, but as a piece of property. She spoke, her voice no more than a whisper, yet it cut through the noise and chaos, a sliver of ice straight into his heart. It was a simple statement, delivered with the calm finality of a judge passing an irrevocable sentence. "That was for the interest," she said, her voice soft and clear. "The principal is yet to be collected. You made a deal a long time ago, Julian. You just forgot who you made it with." He stared at her, uncomprehending, blood filling one of his eyes. "What? Who are you?" he stammered, his voice a pathetic rasp. Ilara's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, no humor. It was a smile of ownership, of a contract finally coming due. "I own your soul," she said. Then she straightened up, letting the broken bottle neck fall from her fingers. It clattered onto the floor beside him. She turned and faced the approaching security guards, with her hands held out in front of her, ready for the cuffs. She showed no resistance, no fear. As they led her away through the gawking, horrified crowd, the strange, serene smile never left her face. She had waited a very, very long time for this night. The first payment had just been made. The interrogation room was a deliberate assault on the senses. The walls were a nauseating shade of institutional beige, scuffed and stained with the ghosts of 1,000 desperate confessions. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, cheap disinfectant, and the faint metallic tang of fear. A single bare bulb hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving light that seemed to bleach all color from the room. It was a world away from the opulent splendor of Aurelia, and Detective Frank Harding liked it that way. Harding was a man carved from cynicism and cheap cigars. His face was a roadmap of late nights and bad decisions. His suit looked like he'd slept in it, and his patience had worn thin somewhere around the turn of the millennium. He'd seen it all: gangsters, killers, con artists, and every flavor of lowlife the city could produce. So when they brought in the waitress who'd brained a tech billionaire with a bottle of champagne, he expected hysterics. Tears. A frantic, rambling story of being pushed too far. He did not get what he expected. Ilara Vance sat opposite him at the scuffed metal table, her hands cuffed in front of her. The red mark of the slap was still visible on her cheek, a stark brand against her pale skin. But her posture was perfect, her breathing even, her eyes clear and unnervingly calm. She hadn't asked for a lawyer. She hadn't asked for a phone call. She had simply sat down and waited. She looked less like a suspect and more like a queen holding court in a dungeon. Harding dropped a thin file on the table between them. It landed with a flat, unimpressive thud. "Ilara Vance," he began, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Age 28, no prior convictions, not so much as a parking ticket. You've worked at Aurelia for 3 years. Before that, a string of other service jobs, clean as a whistle. Which makes me wonder why you decided to redecorate Julian Croft's head with a magnum of Dom Perignon tonight. Ilara's gaze didn't waver. He struck me. I know he struck you, Harding grunted, leaning back in his chair, which groaned in protest. We have 200 witnesses to that. We also have 200 witnesses to you committing aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. His lawyers are already screaming for your head on a platter. This is an open and shut case, Ms. Vance. You're looking at serious time, so unless you want to spend the next decade in a place a lot worse than this room, I suggest you start cooperating. Tell me it was self-defense. Tell me you snapped. Give me something to work with. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Ilara's lips. It wasn't self-defense, Detective. It was a transaction. Harding blinked. A transaction? What are you talking about? Every action has a price, she said, her voice as level as a frozen lake. Julian Croft incurred a debt. I was simply making the first collection. Harding scrubbed a hand over his weary face. He was dealing with a crazy person. A calm, articulate, but completely unhinged woman. Right, a debt. And I suppose the part where you told him you own his soul, was you reading him the terms and conditions? He was mocking her, trying to get a rise, to crack the placid facade. It didn't work. Ilara leaned forward slightly, the movement causing the chain of her handcuffs to clink softly. You think the soul is a metaphor, Detective Harding, a poetic notion. But it's not. It's the sum of a person's choices, their promises, their betrayals. It's the most valuable thing they have to trade, and Julian Croft traded his away a long, long time ago. Her gaze was so intense, so full of ancient certainty, that for a moment Harding felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's poor heating. He shook it off. Okay, let's play along. Who did he trade it to? You? The contract was offered to the universe, Ilara said. I am merely the executor of the estate. Harding had had enough. This was going nowhere. He stood up, ready to hand her over to the system and go get a drink. You're wasting my time. You're going to be arraigned in the morning. Get some sleep if you can. He turned to leave. Ask him about Marcus Thorne, Ilara said, her voice stopping him in his tracks. Harding turned back slowly. The name was vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Who? Marcus Thorne, she repeated, enunciating each syllable with perfect clarity. He was Julian Croft's original partner, the co-founder of Croft Innovations, the brilliant mind behind the company's core technology, the man whose name has been completely erased from the company's history. Harding frowned. Never heard of him. Of course you haven't, Ilara said. That was the point. Ask Julian what happened on the night of October 23rd, 15 years ago. Ask him about the cabin by Silver Lake. Ask him about the partnership dissolution agreement he forged. Ask him why Marcus Thorne, a man terrified of heights, was found at the bottom of Blackwood Gorge 2 days later, a supposed suicide. Every word was a hammer blow, delivered with chilling precision. She was reciting details that couldn't possibly be public knowledge. The forged document, the specific location, the victim's phobia. This wasn't the rambling of a lunatic. This was information, hard, specific, and dangerous. Harding walked back to the table and leaned over it, his face inches from hers. How do you know that? He demanded, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. Ilara's serene smile returned. Because when you own a man's soul, Detective, she said softly, you get a copy of all his receipts. Meanwhile, in a private suite at the city's most expensive hospital, Julian Croft was seething. A team of doctors had stitched the gash on his temple, 7 stitches, they'd said, and diagnosed him with a mild concussion. But the real injury was to his ego. He, Julian Croft, had been assaulted and humiliated by a waitress. A nobody. His high-powered attorney, Stephen Adler, a man who looked like a sleek, well-fed shark in a $1,000 suit, stood by the bed, looking grave. The press is having a field day, Julian, Adler said, scrolling through his phone. They're painting her as some kind of working-class hero. Waitress fights back against tyrant billionaire. It's a PR nightmare. I don't care about PR, Croft roared, his voice cracking. I want her buried. I want her to rot in a cell for the rest of her life. I want her to pay for what she did to me. We will, Julian, we will, Adler said soothingly. Aggravated assault is a serious felony. She's not going anywhere. The police are questioning her now. It's just a matter of time. Croft sank back into his pillows, wincing as a fresh wave of pain shot through his head. But it wasn't just the physical pain that tormented him. It was her words. I own your soul. It was absurd, the raving of a madwoman. And yet, his phone buzzed. It was Adler's associate at the precinct. Adler answered, listened for a moment, his expression shifting from professional concern to confusion, then to shock. What is it? Croft demanded when Adler hung up. Adler looked at his client, his face pale. That was the precinct. The woman, this Ilara Vance. She's talking. Good. Is she confessing? Not exactly, Adler said slowly, his voice unsteady. She's telling them a story, about you, about the early days of the company. He took a deep breath. Julian, she knows about Marcus Thorne. The name hit Julian Croft like a physical blow. All the air went out of the room. The colour drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly grey. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire vanished, replaced by a terrified man staring at a ghost. She knows about the cabin, Adler continued, his voice barely a whisper. She knows about the agreement. She knows everything. Croft stared at his lawyer, his mind reeling. It was impossible. No one knew, no one was left alive who knew the truth of what happened that night. No one except him. A cold dread, colder and deeper than any he had ever known, began to seep into his bones. The woman's whispered words echoed in his concussed mind, no longer sounding like a mad threat, but like a terrible, inescapable truth. You made a deal a long time ago, Julian. And the bill had just arrived. Detective Harding did not believe in the supernatural. He believed in facts, evidence, and the grim, predictable patterns of human greed. The world, in his experience, was a messy, brutal place, but it operated on a set of rational, if often cruel, principles. A woman claiming to own a man's soul did not fit into his worldview. And yet, the name Marcus Thorne had burrowed into his brain like a tick. After leaving Ilara in the interrogation room, he hadn't gone for a drink. He had gone back to his cluttered, coffee-stained desk and started digging. The official Croft Innovations corporate history was a glossy, sanitized fairy tale. Julian Croft, the lone visionary, building an empire from his garage. There was no mention of a partner, no Marcus Thorne. But the city's digital archives were less forgiving. Harding, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a growing sense of unease, found what he was looking for in the pre-dawn hours. A small, forgotten business section article from 15 years ago. It announced the formation of Croft Thorne Technologies, two ambitious young partners poised to change the world. A few months later, another, even smaller blurb. Marcus Thorne had sold his shares to pursue personal interests and had amicably parted ways with the company. Then the final piece, a brief tragic news report from 2 days after the supposed amicable departure. The body of Marcus Thorne, 29, had been recovered from the base of Blackwood Gorge. The death was ruled a suicide. The case was closed. It was all there, just as she'd said. Harding leaned back, the springs of his ancient chair groaning. Coincidence? Maybe she was an investigative journalist or a conspiracy theorist who had gotten lucky. But the cabin at Silver Lake, the forged agreement, the victim's acrophobia, those were not details you found in old newspaper clippings. Those were details you got from a witness or a confession. His next stop was the police archives, a dusty basement that smelled of decaying paper and forgotten crimes. He pulled the file on Marcus Thorne's death. It was thin, the investigation cursory at best. Thorne had been depressed, according to a statement from his then-partner, Julian Croft. He'd been struggling with the pressure. Croft had been the one to identify the body. His grief, the report noted, seemed genuine. Case closed, but Harding, reading it with new eyes, saw the holes. Thorne's family had contested the suicide ruling, claiming he was excited about the company's future and would never have taken his own life. They suspected foul play, but they had no proof and no money to challenge a rising star like Croft. Their pleas had been dismissed. The system had moved on. Harding then ran a background check on Ilara Vance. What he found was both perfectly normal and deeply strange. She had a social security number, a driver's license, a rental history. She paid her taxes, but it all started 5 years ago. Before that, it was as if she didn't exist. No school records, no birth certificate, no digital footprint. It was a clean slate, a manufactured identity. It was the kind of background a deep-cover agent might have, or someone who was hiding from something, or someone who wasn't entirely human. He shook the thought from his head. He was tired. That was all. He went back to the interrogation room. Ilara was exactly as he had left her, serene and patient. "Marcus Thorne," Harding said, sitting down heavily. "His death was ruled a suicide." "A convenient ruling," Ilara replied, her eyes betraying nothing. "His family didn't think so. They thought Croft might have been involved." "They were correct." Harding leaned forward, his voice low. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Ms. Vance. Who are you? And how do you know these things?" Ilara looked at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something that might have been pity in her eyes. "I told you, Detective, I am an executor. Think of me as a cosmic debt collector. Julian Croft took out a loan 15 years ago. He built his entire life, his entire empire, on a foundation of theft and blood. He signed a contract with his own ambition, promising anything for success. The universe listened. And now the bill is due, with interest." She spoke of the universe as if it were a predatory lender. "You're talking about karma," Harding said, trying to put her words into a framework he could understand. "Karma is a passive system of balance," she corrected him gently. "I am an active agent of collection. There is a difference." She began to describe the night of October 23rd, 15 years ago. She spoke of the cold air in the cabin, the smell of pine and whiskey, the crackling of the fire. She described the argument between the two partners, Croft's greed warring with Thorne's caution. She recounted the exact wording of the fraudulent document Croft pushed his partner to sign, a document that stripped Thorne of his equity for a pittance. She described the look of betrayal in Marcus Thorne's eyes. She spoke as if she had been a fly on the wall, a ghost in the room. "He didn't kill him," she clarified. "Not with his own hands. Julian is too much of a coward for that. He simply broke him. He took his life's work, his future, his dream. He left him with nothing. And he knew about Marcus's depression, the darkness he fought every day. He pushed him to the edge of the cliff and let gravity do the rest. In the eyes of the contract, it is the same as murder." Meanwhile, Julian Croft's paranoia was metastasizing. He had discharged himself from the hospital against medical advice, retreating to the sterile, cavernous emptiness of his penthouse apartment. The PR nightmare was escalating. The story of the slap had gone viral, and he was being crucified online. But that was nothing compared to the terror that was now gripping him. Marcus Thorne. He hadn't thought that name in years. He had buried it deep, under layers of money, success, and willful amnesia. Now it was unearthed, and its stench was filling his perfect climate-controlled life. He found himself wandering his home, looking over his shoulder, starting at shadows. He heard whispers in the hum of the air conditioning, saw faces in the grain of the marble floors. Driven by a frantic, desperate need for reassurance, he went to his safe. It was hidden behind a minimalist painting and secured by a biometric scanner. Inside, nestled amongst stock certificates and bearer bonds, was a worn leather portfolio. His hands trembled as he pulled it out. It contained the original documents from the founding of his company. And there it was, the partnership dissolution agreement. He stared at the two signatures at the bottom. His own, a confident, arrogant scrawl, and beneath it, Marcus Thorne's. It was shaky, erratic, the signature of a man under extreme duress, the signature of a man signing his own death warrant. He had always told himself it wasn't his fault, that Marcus was weak, that business was business. But looking at that desperate scrawl, he could almost feel the ghost of his former partner in the room with him, could almost hear his pleas. The lie he had lived with for 15 years was cracking, and he was terrified of what he would find underneath. He had thought he was a king in his castle. He was beginning to realize he was a prisoner in a haunted house of his own making. And the warden had just knocked on the door. Stephen Adler was a man who believed in a few simple truths. Money could solve any problem. The law was a tool to be wielded, not a principle to be respected, and every person had a price. It was this philosophy that had made him the most sought-after and feared corporate lawyer in the city. When he arranged a meeting with Elara Vance, he was confident he could resolve the situation with the elegant, brutal efficiency he was known for. He would offer her a life-changing sum of money in exchange for her silence and a non-disclosure agreement so ironclad it could survive the apocalypse. The assault charge would be quietly dropped. The problem would go away. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the precinct, a neutral ground Adler had insisted upon. He sat at one side of a polished mahogany table, his briefcase open, a settlement offer already drafted. Julian Croft had refused to attend, still holed up in his penthouse, consumed by a paranoid dread that Adler found both unprofessional and irritating. When Elara was led into the room, Adler felt a surge of confidence. She was just a waitress in a drab prison jumpsuit. The red mark on her cheek had faded to a dull purplish bruise. She looked small, insignificant. He had broken people far more powerful than her. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice a smooth, reassuring baritone. "I am Stephen Adler, Mr. Croft's legal counsel. I'm here because I believe there has been a grave misunderstanding. My client acted deplorably, and for that he is prepared to offer his sincerest apologies and a substantial financial settlement to ensure your future comfort and security." He slid a folder across the table. "Inside you will find an offer for $2 million, tax-free. All we require is your signature on the accompanying non-disclosure agreement, and this whole unfortunate incident can be put behind us." Elara did not look at the folder. She looked directly at Stephen Adler, her eyes calm and analytical, as if she were studying an insect under a microscope. $2 million, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Is that the going rate for a man's soul these days? I would have thought Julian's would be worth less, considering its condition." Adler's professional smile tightened. "This is a generous offer, Ms. Vance. I would advise you to take it. The alternative is a felony conviction and years in prison." "You speak of prisons," Elara said, a strange intensity entering her voice. "Let's talk about the ones we build for ourselves, the ones made of secrets." She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Mr. Adler, do you still have nightmares about the hit and run on the Palisades Parkway? The one from 12 years ago?" The blood drained from Stephen Adler's face, his carefully composed expression shattered, replaced by one of pure, naked shock. The Palisades Parkway. It was his darkest secret, a drunken mistake from his youth when he was a hungry young associate. He had hit a cyclist on a dark road and fled the scene. The man had been seriously injured, but survived. No one had ever found out. He had buried the guilt so deep, he had almost convinced himself it never happened. How could you possibly know about that?" he stammered, his voice losing its confident timbre. "It was the same year you were made partner at your firm," Elara continued, her voice relentless. "Over a more qualified, more senior associate. Your predecessor had a gambling problem, a problem you discovered and used as leverage to secure your promotion. The hit and run, the blackmail, they were the foundation of your success, your own Faustian bargain. You see, Mr. Adler, everyone makes a deal. Julian is not unique." Adler stared at her, his mind reeling. This was impossible. She was peeling back the layers of his life, exposing the rotten core he had kept hidden from the world. The power dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer the shark. He was the one in the water, bleeding. "What do you want?" he whispered, the settlement folder forgotten on the table. "I want you to deliver a message to your client," Elara said. "Tell him the time for deals is over. The time for payment is now." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "And tell him I know because Marcus Thorne was my father." The confession hung in the air, simple, devastating, and absolute. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about a random act of violence in a restaurant. This wasn't about a crazy woman with a messiah complex. This was about revenge. A cold, calculated 15-year-old vengeance. "My father wasn't a saint," Elara said, her voice softening for the first time, a hint of long-buried grief coloring her words. He was a brilliant, hopeful, and sometimes naive man who struggled with depression. He trusted the wrong person. He poured his heart and soul into their company, and Julian Croft stole it from him. He didn't just steal the technology, Mr. Adler. He stole my father's future. He stole my future. My father didn't jump from that gorge. Julian pushed him. The cosmic debt collector, the executor of the universe, it was all a metaphor, a terrifying, effective metaphor for a daughter's righteous fury. She wasn't a supernatural entity. She was something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and a singular, all-consuming purpose. She reached into the pocket of her jumpsuit. A guard tensed, but she moved slowly, pulling out a small, worn, leather-bound journal. She placed it on the table next to Adler's multi-million-dollar settlement offer. "This was my father's journal," she said. "He wrote in it every day." The last entry is dated October 23rd, the night he met with Julian at the cabin. In it, he details everything: the threats, the fraudulent contract, Croft's confession that he was deliberately bankrupting him to force him out. He wrote that he was afraid for his life. He gave this journal to me that afternoon, telling me to keep it safe, just in case. I was 13 years old. Adler stared at the journal as if it were a bomb. It was a witness from the grave. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. It transformed the case from a corporate dispute into a potential wrongful death, or even a homicide investigation. "For 15 years I have planned this," Alara said, her voice now a cold whisper. "I created a new identity. I worked menial jobs, saved my money, and learned everything I could about Julian Croft. I watched him build an empire on my father's bones, flaunting his wealth, becoming a monster. I got a job at his favorite restaurant, and I waited. I waited for the perfect moment, for him to show the world exactly who he is. And last night he did. He struck a helpless waitress in a room full of witnesses. He gave me the stage I needed." She stood up, the meeting clearly over. "The slap wasn't the reason I broke that bottle over his head. It was the excuse. The champagne wasn't the weapon, it was the punctuation. The real weapon," she said, tapping the small journal, "is the truth." Stephen Adler sat frozen in his chair long after she had been escorted out. The $2 million offer seemed like a pathetic joke. He looked at the journal, the testament of a dead man, and he knew. This wasn't a legal problem anymore. This was a reckoning. And it was going to burn Julian Croft's entire world to the ground. The collapse was not gradual. It was a cataclysm. Stephen Adler, a man whose entire career was built on damage control, knew when a fire was too big to be contained. He walked out of that conference room, left the journal on the table for Detective Harding to find, and made a single phone call. Not to Julian Croft, but to his own partners. He was invoking the firm's catastrophic client failure clause. He was cutting Julian Croft loose. The shark, smelling blood in the water, was saving itself. Detective Harding, armed with the journal, now had more than just a 15-year-old cold case. He had a Rosetta Stone that translated Julian Croft's success into a story of fraud, coercion, and manslaughter. The district attorney's office, smelling a high-profile conviction, convened a grand jury with breathtaking speed. The journal was leaked to the press. No one ever found out exactly how. Perhaps a clerk in the DA's office, perhaps Harding himself, wanting to apply public pressure. The effect was incendiary. The story exploded across every news network and social media platform. Julian Croft, the self-made tech mogul, was recast as Julian Croft, the predatory monster who had built his fortune on the grave of his partner. The narrative was irresistible. The billionaire's slap was no longer just an act of arrogance, but the final public twitch of a deeply corrupt soul. Croft Innovations stock went into freefall. The price plummeted by 70% in 48 hours, wiping out billions of dollars in market value. The board of directors, a collection of ruthless capitalists who had admired Croft's killer instinct, suddenly found that instinct directed at them. They convened an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to oust him as CEO and chairman. They issued a public statement denouncing him, erasing his name from their corporate history as thoroughly as he had once erased Marcus Thorne's. His life disintegrated. The model with the vacant eyes vanished. Her ghost-written social media post about needing to find my own truth, a transparent dash for the lifeboats. His so-called friends, The sycophants who had orbited his wealth stopped answering his calls. The invitations to galas and charity balls were rescinded. The wings of hospitals and museums that bore his name began hastily making plans for rebranding. In less than a week, he went from being the king of the city to its most reviled pariah. He was alone, a ghost rattling around in his palatial penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling windows now feeling less like a view of his kingdom and more like the glass walls of a fishbowl. He watched the news reports, his own face staring back at him, twisted into a mask of villainy. He read the entries from Marcus's journal, published online for the world to see, each word a fresh indictment. The whispers he'd been hearing were now a deafening roar, the voices of the public, of the board, of his past. The assault charges against Ilara Vance were quietly dropped. The DA had bigger fish to fry, and in the court of public opinion she was already a folk hero. She was released from custody, blinking in the sudden glare of the media frenzy. She ignored the reporters' shouted questions, pulling the hood of a simple grey sweatshirt over her head and disappearing into the city crowds. She didn't go to the press. She didn't go to a lawyer to file a civil suit. She went to him, the doorman at Croft's building, a man who had once bowed and scraped before him, let her in without a word. The private elevator whisked her up to the penthouse. The door was unlocked. She found him in his vast living room. He was a shell of the man who had sat at table 7. His expensive suit was rumpled and stained, his face was pale and unshaven, and his eyes were hollow, haunted pits of despair. A half-empty bottle of ludicrously expensive scotch sat on the table beside him. He looked up as she entered, and there was no anger, no defiance, only a deep, soul-crushing weariness. He was a man who had already been defeated. "You," he croaked, his voice raw. "Me," she said, her voice soft. She walked across the marble floor and stood before him. The vast city skyline glittered behind her, a universe of lights that no longer belonged to him. "Did you come here to gloat?" he asked, a pathetic tremor in his voice. "To watch me burn?" "No," Ilara said. "I came here to explain the terms of your contract. You seem to have misunderstood them." He stared at her, confused. "When I told you I own your soul, you thought it was a threat of damnation." "Hellfire and brimstone," she said, a sad, knowing look on her face. "It's so much simpler than that, Julian. Your soul wasn't some mystical essence. It was this." She gestured around the room, at the priceless art on the walls, the panoramic views, the symbols of a life built on a lie. "It was the company, the money, the power, the reputation, the life you stole from my father. That is your soul. And yes, I own it. Because I was the only one who had the power to take it all away from you. And now I have." He finally understood. This was not a supernatural punishment. It was a meticulously engineered, real-world demolition. She hadn't damned him to hell. She had brought hell to him. "What now?" he whispered. "You've won. You've destroyed me. Are you going to kill me?" The question was asked, not with fear, but with a strange, bleak hope. "No," Ilara said. "That would be too easy. That would be an ending. You don't deserve an ending yet. You deserve a reckoning. So I'm going to give you a choice. The only choice you have left." She stood over him, no longer just a waitress, no longer just a daughter seeking revenge. She was a figure of absolute, unwavering justice. "Choice 1, she said, her voice as clear as a bell. "You walk out of this building, you go to Detective Harding's office, and you confess. You tell them everything. You detail the fraud, the coercion, the deliberate psychological cruelty that led to my father's death. You accept the judgment of the law, and you spend what's left of your life in a real prison, not just this gilded one. You will have nothing, but you will have paid your debt in a way the world can understand." She paused, letting the weight of that option settle. "Or choice 2. You do nothing. You stay here, in this empty monument to your greed. The DA will still come for you, but you can fight it. You can drag it out for years with the last of your money. But you will never escape. You will live as a ghost, haunted by what you've done, despised by everyone. You will wake up every morning in a cold sweat, remembering my father's face. You will see his ghost in every reflection. You will live the rest of your days in a prison of your own mind, a torment far worse than any jail cell. You will have your freedom, but your soul will remain in my possession, rotting from the inside out." She had laid out his damnation, a public, finite punishment or a private, eternal one. She wasn't offering him redemption, she was offering him a choice of poisons. "The choice is yours, Julian," she said, her voice softening to a near whisper. "Confess and face justice, or hide and face yourself. Decide what you deserve." She turned and walked towards the door, her work almost done. She left him alone in the echoing silence of his ruined empire, with nothing but his ghosts and the terrible final choice he had to make. The silence in the penthouse after Elara left was a physical presence. It was heavier than the marble countertops, more vast than the panoramic windows. For Julian Croft, it was the sound of his entire world having ended. He sat there for a day and a night, the city lights outside turning on and off, marking the passage of time he no longer felt a part of. He didn't drink, he didn't eat. He simply sat and listened to the silence, which was filled with the echoes of his past. He thought of Marcus Thorne not as the obstacle he had crushed, but as the friend he had once been. He remembered their late nights in a cramped garage, fueled by cheap pizza and impossible dreams. He remembered the spark of genius in Marcus's eyes, the shared laughter, the genuine belief that they were going to change the world together. He remembered the precise moment when his own ambition had curdled into a toxic greed, the moment he decided that half of a kingdom wasn't enough. He thought of Elara. He saw her not as the waitress he had struck, but as the 13-year-old girl her father had left behind, a child forced to carry the weight of a horrific secret for 15 years. He imagined her life, the lonely, patient years spent plotting, her grief and rage honed into a weapon of devastating precision. He had not just destroyed one life, he had shattered another, creating the very instrument of his own destruction. Elara's choice was a masterstroke of cruelty, or perhaps of mercy. It was not a choice between freedom and imprisonment. It was a choice about the nature of his punishment. To confess was to accept an external judgment, to hand himself over to a system. To hide was to accept an internal one, a self-imposed damnation where he would be both prisoner and jailer for the rest of his miserable days. In the grey light of the second dawn, something inside him finally broke. It wasn't pride or fear or even the instinct for self-preservation. It was the last, withered shred of his own humanity. He realized that living as a ghost in his own life was not a life at all. The only path forward, the only way to silence the screaming in his head, was to finally, after 15 years, face the truth. He showered, shaved, and put on a simple dark suit, a stark contrast to the flamboyant attire he once favored. He looked like a man preparing for his own funeral. He walked out of the penthouse, rode the elevator down, and stepped out onto the street. He didn't take a car. He walked. He walked for miles through the city he once thought he owned, now just an anonymous man in a crowd of people who despised him. He walked into the main police precinct, past the front desk, and straight to Detective Harding's office. Harding looked up from his paperwork, his expression unreadable. "I'm here to make a full confession," Julian Croft said, his voice quiet but steady. And he did. He told Harding everything, leaving out no detail, making no excuse. He confessed to the fraud, the forgery, the psychological campaign that drove Marcus Thorne to his death. He confessed it all. It was not the act of a man seeking leniency, it was the act of a man finally unburdening himself of a weight that had crushed his soul long ago. The legal process was swift. With his confession, the mountain of evidence, and the public outcry, the trial was a formality. Julian Croft was convicted of fraud, manslaughter, and a host of other financial crimes. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in a maximum security prison. His remaining assets were seized and liquidated. The empire built on a lie was officially dissolved. Elara did not attend the trial. She followed it in the news, a distant observer to the final act of a play she had written and directed. When it was over, she felt not triumph, but a quiet, hollow sense of completion. The rage that had fueled her for half her life had burned itself out, leaving behind a profound emptiness. A significant portion of Croft's liquidated assets were awarded, by court order, to a new foundation established in her father's name. The Thorne Foundation for Ethical Innovation. Elara was appointed its director. Months later, the world had mostly moved on. Julian Croft was a name whispered as a cautionary tale. Aurelia Restaurant had a new owner, and Ilara Vance was no longer a waitress. She stood in a bright, modern office, the headquarters of the Thorne Foundation. On the walls were not priceless works of art, but blueprints and schematics from young, brilliant inventors, the kind of people her father had been. The money that had been stolen from him was now being used to fund the dreams of others like him, a final poetic justice. She picked up a framed photograph from her desk. It was the last picture she had of her and her father, taken just a week before he died. They were both smiling, a genuine, hopeful light in their eyes. She traced the outline of his face with her finger. The debt was paid. The contract was closed. She had not only reclaimed her father's legacy, she had redeemed it. The ghost of Marcus Thorne could finally rest. And Ilara, after 15 long years in the cold, could finally begin to live. The waitress was gone. The Avenger was gone. All that remained was a daughter, finally at peace.